important in terms of the influence that the Muslims have had on the West. In the 9th century, in the 850s, one of the extraordinary characters that shows up in Spain and becomes a character in the court is a man called Ziryab. And Ziryab was an absolute genius. He was a poet, he was a musician, he was actually a connoisseur of food. He was also a type of Beau Grumble character who was a bon vivant. He liked very fancy clothes, and his hairstyle was different from the Spanish hairstyle, but because he was so popular, the Spanish men began to actually imitate his hairstyle, which shows you celebrities have always been around and have an effect on culture. People think that's a modern phenomenon, but the reality of it is, it's not. Now, Ziryab, who was actually fled from the court in Iraq, one of the things that Ziryab did, which is really interesting, is he started a conservatory of music and began to teach music to the Spanish Muslims. Now, he developed a type of instrument from a lute, the oud, and lute in European language comes from al-oud. He developed it by adding a string, and the Spaniards called it the guitarra morisco, the Moorish guitar, which becomes the guitar. Now, because of this, he introduced very sophisticated music from the East, Persian maqamat, what are called maqamat. And one of the things this music was used for was to treat people for illnesses. And so there were actually hospitals in Cordoba that used music to treat the mentally ill. And this is based on a Greek theory that comes from Pythagoras called the ethos theory of music, that the soul is actually affected by the vibrations of sound. And we know this from the Quran. The Quran is a very sonorous, very mellifluous and soothing speech that part of it is the resonance that it has on the soul. And so the Quran is a shifa as well. And I don't want to compare the Quran to music at all because that's haram to do. But it's very interesting that they use these. And I'll just give you one example. In this science, there's the maqam al-rast, which is a maqam that uses the key of C. And the key of C is a very soothing key, and it's often used in popular music. And in fact, when I was talking with Yousuf Islam about this, and he said that was one of my favorite keys to write in. So like Peace Train is written in the key of C. But this maqam al-rast actually soothes people and calms them down. So they would use this in the hospitals, and they called them Meristan or Bimaristan. And this was also in Fes, and I visited one in Fes. This science is still taught in Turkey, and they still use music therapy in Turkey. So it's actually used. Now, this is a very interesting influence on the West, and it's a little sidetrack here, but I find it fascinating. There are two major musical influences on Western civilization. The first is Spain and then Italy through Sicily that goes up. Classical music develops in Italy, and the reason is because classical music's roots are in Sicilian Andalusian music, which was very, very popular, and even many of the ulama of that time would listen to it. And this is still the case in Morocco. Even though the majority, the mashhur of the four madhabs, so I'm not promoting music or anything, the mashhur of the four madhabs is stringed instruments and these things. They say don't listen to them, but percussion instruments are permitted for festive occasions, things like that, and singing, the majority permit that. Some prohibit it. So I don't want to talk about the specificities of halal and haram about this. I'm talking about the sociological phenomenon of music in Andalusia. This music actually moves into Europe through the troubadours. Now, troubadour, most of the dictionaries of etymology say troubadour comes from tarab, the mutrib. You know, the Arabs say zamar al-hay la yutrib. You know, the musician of the neighborhood doesn't entertain anybody. They don't want to listen to him. So the mutrib, the troubadours, were the traveling musicians. And they would often sing love songs, which is ghazal, because the Arabs and the Arabic language is a language of love. It's a language of hub. And so these troubadours move into the provincial France. And you get all of these troubadours singing in France love songs. And then that moves to England and also to the Celtic lands. So Celtic music is directly related to, and this has been proven by ethnomusicologists, that there is a direct relationship to Celtic music and Spanish music. Now, the other very strange connection, and this was only recently developed in a very interesting book called Africa and the Blues, because blues is a very American music, and it's the music of the African American slaves. And if you listen to early slave recordings, and I've heard them from the late 19th century, where they still had freed slaves who were alive, and they recorded them singing, you can't distinguish between their singing and the adhan. It's just amazing. I have a recording of this, and it just amazes you, the same guttural sounds. Now, these two influences through Europe via Spain and through Africa come into America with the Appalachian Celtic influences and then the Delta Mississippi blues influences, and this creates what we call rock and roll. But I really believe we should call it Moroccan roll, because the connection is really extraordinary. And I'll give you an example. The basis of rock and roll is a 4/4 beat. In fact, they call it the Bo Diddley beat. That's called the Bo Diddley beat in rock and roll. Now, if you ever heard Van Morrison, and I liked him before I was Muslim, if you ever hear Van Morrison he's a 60s singer, he sings a song where he goes, la 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 la. Say it again. La 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 la. Where'd that come from? La 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 ilaha illallah. That's where it came from. Now, one of the interesting things about rock and roll music, because my father plays piano, and one of his friends who was a jazz musician in New York, Cy Walter, when rock and roll first came out in the late 50s, my father asked him, what do you think about this wretched music? He said, it'll never last. And he said, why not? And he said, because all it has is a beat. But he didn't know what that beat was based on. You know, because I really believe that it's actually resonating in people's hearts. Something's resonating in people's hearts. They're hearing something. And the rock and roll beat is based on a 4/4 beat. And the kalima, la ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, is based on 4/4 beats. And that's why all of the Muslim inshad is based on these basic rhythms. And so you have this connection in Spanish. All the Spanish singing, if you've ever heard the Andalusian singing, a lot of it is singing La ilaha illallah. A lot of the West African music is singing La ilaha illallah. So here they're saying La 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 la. In Morocco they're saying La ilaha illallah. So we just need to fix the voweling for them, right? Which is going to take some work, but it can happen. And in fact, there was an album that won a Grammy a few years ago that Santana produced. And in that song, you know, the song says there's a devil under the bed. He's telling you to be afraid. And there's an angel over your head. And you can hear him say, and then it comes in, La ilaha illallah. Like they sing that, literally, La ilaha illallah. And it fits in that 4/4 rhythm. So that's just a side thing, which I find really interesting. And I think Muslims should study this to bring this out. It's really important that people see where this stuff comes from and why it has an effect on people. So that is one of the interesting aspects of Spanish influence on the West, is the musical influence. Now, the Muslims of Spain were completely in love with learning, or I should rather say certain cities. In fact, Cordoba, Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who grew up in Seville, Ashbilia, he said about Cordoba, إذا مات موسيقي في قرطبة نقلت آلاته الموسيقية إلى أشبية حتى تباع. If a musician in Cordoba died, all his instruments were sent to Seville in order to sell them. وإذا مات عالم في أشبية نقلت كتبه إلى قرطبة حتى تباع. But if a scholar in Seville died, his books were sent to Cordoba in order for them to be sold, because Seville was known as a party town. There's people when they go to university, they don't choose like Harvard or Yale. They choose universities that they know are known for partying. Seriously, this is true. People go to universities. I'll give you a good, I don't want any of you to apply here, but a good party school is the University of Arizona in San Antonio. That's a famous party school. People go there to have a good time for 4 years. But if you want to study, you have to go to a serious school. Well, the same is true in the Muslim countries. There were cities that were known, like Cordoba was a city known for knowledge. Ashbilia was a city known for a lot of fun and activity. To this day, Seville is still known as a party town, and Cordoba is considered a city of great learning. To this day, Cordoba is still a place, it's a university town that has much learning in it. It's just amazing. It's sunnatullah fi khalqihi. So the learning, the desire for learning was immense in Andalusia. And this is really the strength of this country. During the period of the Umayyad, scholars came from all over. One of the most interesting aspects of Andalusian scholarship is that they encouraged something was called a rihla. The rihla was where a scholar would travel to another country and to take a journey to the east in order to gain more knowledge, and then would come back, and they would often see an extraordinary change in that scholar's perspective. This is very important, and I would encourage it for our ikhwanuna fil Khalij. Some of the ulama in the Khalij would really benefit by taking journeys of knowledge to other countries where they can sit with other ulama and listen to other ulama, because when ulama are stuck in one little provincial area and all they know is their own area, they're not able to really think in a more global or more broad perspective. So exchanging of students is very important. This is what the Andalusians would do. In fact, Ibn Hazm, who's a mutashaddid amongst those scholars, was known for not making the rihla. And maybe there's a relationship to Ibn Hazm's harshness in certain issues and the fact that he never took that great journey to acquire knowledge from scholars in the East. One of the great travelers of the East was Ahmad ibn Maslama al-Mijriti. Now this man in the late 10th, early 11th century, he made a journey and he brought back the system of numeration that had gone all over numeracy in the East. So he brought back what are called the Arqam al-Hindiya, and they developed, the Andalusians and the Moroccans developed their own system, which is called Al-Arqam al-Arabiya. And this is very important to note that the Arabic numerals are not Indian numerals. The Arabic numerals of the Morocco and of the North African countries were developed by the Muslims themselves and relate to angles. These were taught to one of the students, Gerbert, who learned in Spain, studied in a school in Spain. Gerbert becomes Pope Sylvester. Pope Sylvester introduced numerals into Europe. Where did he get that knowledge? He got it from the Muslims. And numerals, I will guarantee you, numerals are the secret of the power of Western civilization. And if you don't believe me, read a book called The Measure of Everything, which is about how the Western scientists began to measure everything. And they did it because they were empowered by numerals. And that's why, and I've said this before, but the problem is not weapons of mass destruction. The problem is weapons of math instruction. Because it's only through higher mathematics that you can develop weapons of mass destruction. And that's why Imam al-Ghazali, they warned about a ta'ammuq fil handasa, because they were concerned about that aspect. If the people that master these sciences aren't morally righteous, upright people, they can actually really harm people and do terrible things. So the Muslims introduced these numbers into Europe, and then Europe took these numbers and measured and quantified everything. They developed calculus. Leibniz and Newton developed calculus, and calculus has empowered Western civilization, really, completely. So the Western dominance that we witness now on the globe is a direct result of a pope that studied from Muslims who believed that knowledge was for humanity. And this is very important, and I want to wind down here because it's such a fascinating period. And I actually lived in Spain. I lived in Spain for over a year in Granada. So just a few things about the contributions of Spain. The Spaniards invented crystal. Spanish Muslims invented crystal, the highest form of glass. The Spanish invented the idea of a movement in music, noba. It's called a noba, yatanawab. It's a change. Western music, if you look at classical music, Western music, the hallmark of it is movements. Where did they get the word from? They got it from Spanish music. Many of the instruments used in classical music came through Spain. Do you see? In fact, the piano, which is the highest of the Western classical instruments, along with the violin, both of them are introductions from the East by Muslims. The piano is an extended, what they call the kanun. The kanun, if you look at a kanun and look inside a piano, it's identical. Really, it's identical. The piano is a percussion instrument. The kanun is a plucked instrument. The piano is struck. And who invented the kanun? Al-Farabi. The Muslim philosopher Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi was a genius. He spoke 70 languages. There's a famous story. He came into a gathering in Halab of one of the Umara, and he was wearing an Anatolian suit because he'd studied logic from Greece. And he was just sitting there, and the ulama were talking, and one of the servants spoke a very strange dialect. And the Amir was trying to explain something to the servant, and the servant couldn't understand. So Farabi spoke to the servant, and the Amir looked at him and he said, "Tuhsinu hadi lahja?" He said, "Do you speak this dialect?" He said, "Ana utqinu sab'ina lugha." He said, "I speak 70 languages." They say, "Do you know anything about Arabic?" He said, "Well, test me." And so the grammarians started testing him. They went on and on until they all said, "This man knows more than anybody." And then he began to talk about logic, and they were completely amazed. And so the Amir said, "Do you know anything about music?" And he said, "Yes, bring me a oud." So they brought him a oud, and he played the oud and made them all laugh. And then he played the oud and he made them all cry, and then he put them to sleep. Because he wrote a book, which I actually have in my library, called Kitab al-Musiq al-Kabir, the big book of music. It's this big. I mean, it's ism ala musamma. And in that book, he teaches you how to use music to affect the emotions of people, which is the reason Plato in the Republic said music should be prohibited, because it's too powerful a weapon and it affects the emotions of people, and most musicians don't know what they're doing. So they get people agitated. You know, you go to a rock concert and suddenly people are beating each other up and they don't know why. Well, if you play that music like that, you know, everybody's going like that and lighting candles. And so this was something that the Muslims, the influence that they had, all of these things, music on the movements, and also the extraordinary advancements in astronomy.